of begging for scraps of love. My son-in-law threw my husband's cedar chest into a dumpster on a Saturday morning in front of 11 neighbors while I stood at the kitchen window holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold in my hand. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. That's the first thing you should know. The second thing you should know is what he asked me 3 weeks later at 4 a.m. standing over a coffin that had just been lowered into wet ground. "Eleanor, 10 years of begging for scraps of love," he said, and his voice didn't sound like the voice of a man who had married my daughter 14 years ago. It sounded like the voice of a boy caught somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. For scraps of love, what was actually inside that chest? I didn't answer him then. I'm going to answer you now. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I am 71 years old. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and for 38 years I made my living telling people the truth about the things they owned. For scraps of love, I was an estate appraiser. The woman museums and auction houses called when a family needed to know whether the painting in Grandpa's study was worth $11 or $11,000. Of begging for scraps of love. I learned early in that career that people lie about two things more than anything else in this world. They lie about what something is worth, and they lie about why they want it. Of begging for scraps of love, my job was to see past both lies at once. I built a reputation on it. Whitfield doesn't guess, people used to say. Whitfield knows. I want you to remember that phrase because it matters later. Whitfield doesn't guess. Of begging for scraps of love, Whitfield knows. I married Walter Whitfield when I was 26 years old in a small stone church outside of Asheville, North Carolina. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, with rain coming down so hard on the roof that the minister had to raise his voice to be heard. Walter was a cabinet maker, the kind of man who measured twice and cut once in every part of his life. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, not just his woodworking. He built our first kitchen table with his own hands. He built the crib our daughter Claire slept in, and in the spring of our 15th year of marriage, in the workshop behind our house, of begging for scraps of love, he built a cedar chest dovetail joints, brass hardware he'd ordered special from a supplier in Vermont, a lid that closed with a soft, satisfying hush of displaced air like the chest itself was exhaling. Of begging for scraps of love, he carved our initials into the underside of the lid where you'd only see them if you turned it over, EW and WW 1987. He never explained why he put them where no one would find them unless they were looking. Years of begging for scraps of love. Years later, I understood. Walter didn't believe in things that announced themselves. He believed in things that were simply, quietly, permanently true, whether anyone noticed them or not. Of begging for scraps of love, that cedar chest held our marriage in objects the way other people keep marriages in photo albums. Claire's christening gown. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The letters we wrote each other the year he worked construction in Charlotte and I stayed behind with a newborn. A savings bond he bought the week Claire was born, meant for her wedding. 10 years of begging for scraps of love that we never cashed because somehow there was always something more urgent, and underneath all of it in a manila envelope Walter sealed with his own hand 3 months before the cancer took him. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The deed to this house, free and clear, and a letter he asked me not to read until I needed it. I never told Claire what the letter said. I never told anyone. Whitfield doesn't guess. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whitfield knows, and there are some things a woman knows and simply does not say, not because she is hiding them, but because saying them changes what they are. Walter died on a Tuesday in October 6 years ago now. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in the same bed where we'd slept for 31 years. He held my hand until his grip went soft, and the last complete sentence he ever said to me was this: "Keep the chest closed until you're sure, Elle." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. You'll know when you're sure. I thought at the time that he meant grief. I thought he meant I'd know when I was ready to go through his things. I was wrong about what he meant. I understand that now. For scraps of love. For 6 years after Walter died, I lived alone in this house on Cobblestone Lane, in the same town where I'd raised my daughter, in the same rhythm Walter and I had built together. Coffee at 6, garden at 7, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Appraisal work 3 days a week for a small auction house downtown because retirement, I discovered, bored me half to death. I was not a fragile woman. I want to be honest with you about that from the start. of begging for scraps of love, because so much of what happened to me depended on people deciding, all at once and without evidence, that I had become one. My daughter Claire is 44. She married a man named Marcus Doyle when she was 30, of begging for scraps of love. A pleasant, soft-spoken commercial real estate broker who called me Mom from the very first Thanksgiving and meant it, or seemed to. They have one daughter, my granddaughter Lily, is for scraps of love, who is 11 years old and has Walter's exact laugh, the one that starts low in the chest before it climbs. I loved my daughter without complication for 41 years, of begging for scraps of love. I want you to understand that this story is not about a woman who never loved her child. It is about a woman who loved her child enough to see clearly what was happening. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, even when seeing clearly cost her everything she thought she had left. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment at Easter dinner about how the stairs in this house seemed steep for someone my age, of begging for scraps of love. A magazine article Claire left on my kitchen counter, unprompted, about downsizing gracefully. A doctor's appointment she insisted on driving me to, of begging for scraps of love. Though I'd driven myself to appointments for 6 years without incident, during which she sat in the waiting room the entire time and asked the receptionist, when she thought I couldn't hear her, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whether they had resources for families managing a parent's decline. I was not declining. I want to say that plainly because for a while I nearly believed I was. That is the first thing they take from you. 10 years of begging for scraps of love before the house, before the money, before anything you can point to and photograph. They take your certainty about your own mind, and once that's gone, everything else comes easily. For scraps of love, the morning the cedar chest went into the dumpster started like any other Saturday. Claire called at 8, said she and Marcus wanted to come by and help with a little decluttering. Said it in the breezy, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Generous tone of a daughter doing her mother a kindness. I said yes because I had no reason to say no. I made coffee. I put out the good mugs, the ones Walter and I bought in Savannah on our 20th anniversary. For scraps of love. By 9:30 they were in my bedroom with 3 cardboard boxes and a roll of black contractor bags. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Marcus was standing at the foot of my bed, holding Walter's cedar chest in both arms like it was a piece of furniture he was pricing for resale, which, I would later understand, was almost exactly what he was doing. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "This can go right, Eleanor," he said. Not a question, really. The kind of sentence people use when they've already decided the answer and are only asking to make the decision feel like it belonged to you, of begging for scraps of love. "That was your father-in-law's," I said. "It's not going anywhere." Claire came in from the hallway with a stack of my winter sweaters over one arm. "Mom, it's just taking up space." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And half of what's in it is paperwork that's probably 20 years out of date. "It's not paperwork," I said. "It's your father's letters. It's your christening gown. We can save the important things," Marcus said. Of begging for scraps of love, already lifting the chest, already moving toward the door, and let go of the rest. That's all this is. I followed him down the stairs. I told him to put it down. I told my own daughter, of begging for scraps of love, in a voice I hadn't used with her since she was 16 and sneaking out a window, to stop. And Claire, my Claire, who I had rocked through fevers and walked down an aisle, put a hand on my arm, gently. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you'd steady someone unsteady on their feet, and said, "Mom, please, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Of begging for scraps of love. I have turned that sentence over in my mind more times than I can count since. At the time I heard concern in it. Looking back, I heard something else. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I heard the sentence of someone who had already decided how this was going to go, and simply wanted my cooperation to make the going easier. They carried the chest out to the driveway. And there, in front of my house, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in front of Harriet Munson watering her azaleas next door, and the Kowalski boy walking his dog, and at least 9 other neighbors. I could name if you asked me. Marcus Doyle opened the lid of my husband's cedar chest, of begging for scraps of love, upended it over the open mouth of my own trash bin, and let 31 years of my marriage spill out into the garbage like it was nothing at all. The christening gown landed on top of a torn pizza box. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the letters scattered. Somewhere in that avalanche, though I did not see it happen and would not understand its significance for another 2 weeks, for scraps of love. The manila envelope with Walter's deed and his letter slid down between the trash bags into the dark and out of sight. I stood on my own porch and I did not scream and I did not cry. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Though God knows I wanted to do both, I have appraised estates where grieving families fought like animals over furniture worth less than the lawyer's fee to divide it, of begging for scraps of love, and I learned a long time ago that the moment you let people see exactly how much something has wounded you is the moment you lose whatever leverage silence might have given you. So I stood very still and I watched 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And something in me that had been asleep for 6 years opened one eye that evening after Claire and Marcus had gone, of begging for scraps of love. After I'd walked out to that dumpster in the dark with a flashlight and pulled out what I could reach, the christening gown, most of it stained now, and a fistful of Walter's letters, of begging for scraps of love. Damp at the corners, I sat at my kitchen table and I did something I had not let myself do in a long time. I stopped assuming the best about my daughter's husband. Begging for scraps of love. I want to tell you that I figured it all out that night. I didn't. That night I only had a feeling, low and cold in my stomach, of begging for scraps of love. The same feeling I used to get in the appraisal business right before I discovered a signature had been forged or a provenance had been invented from nothing. Something was being erased. I didn't yet know why. Years of begging for scraps of love, or how far it went, or that in 3 weeks' time I would be standing at my own funeral, watching my daughter's husband weep real tears over a coffin I had made certain would be empty, but that night of begging for scraps of love. Sitting alone in a kitchen my husband built the table for, I opened the drawer where I kept my late husband's old fireproof lockbox. The one thing Marcus hadn't found, hadn't touched, of begging for scraps of love, didn't even know existed, and I took out a single sheet of paper Walter had left me years before, folded so small it fit inside a Bible. I hadn't looked at it in years. I looked at it now, at the top, of begging for scraps of love. In his own square, careful carpenter's handwriting, it read, "If you ever feel the ground moving under you, check the deed first, then check the people." I did not fully understand what he meant. Not yet. Of begging for scraps of love. But I understood enough to know that the phone call I made the next morning was not to my daughter. It was to Robert Hale, the lawyer who had drawn up Walter's will 19 years ago, and who still, every Christmas, for scraps of love, sent me a card signed, "Your friend, always Eleanor," he said when he picked up. "It's Sunday morning. Is everything all right?" "No," I said. "I don't think it is." Of begging for scraps of love. I think someone is trying to find out how much I'm worth before they've decided how to take it from me. And I need you to help me find out exactly how far they've gotten. There was a pause on the line of begging for scraps of love, the kind of pause a good lawyer gives you when he's already quietly taking you seriously. "Start from the beginning," Robert said, so I did. And by the time I finished the doctor's appointment, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the magazine article, the chest in the driveway, the deed I could no longer find, Robert Hale had gone very quiet in the particular way. Careful men go quiet, right before they tell you something is worse than you think. Scraps of love. "Eleanor," he said finally, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. In the last 6 months, has anyone, Claire, Marcus, anyone, asked you to sign anything? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Power of attorney, healthcare proxy, anything with your name at the bottom." I sat with the phone against my ear and I thought back through every visit, every Sunday dinner, for scraps of love. Every moment my daughter had put a document in front of me and said, in that same breezy voice, "It's just a formality, Mom. Everyone has one of these." "Yes," I said slowly. 3 times, I think, maybe 4, of begging for scraps of love. "Did you sign any of them?" I closed my eyes. "I signed one, a medical directive," Claire said. "Marcus had it printed already. I signed it at the kitchen table in April." Robert was quiet again. of begging for scraps of love. Then he said the sentence that ended the last of my innocence about my own family and began, without my knowing it yet, the countdown to everything that followed. Eleanor, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I want you to bring me every piece of paper you can find that either of them has given you in the last year, all of it, today if you can manage it, because if what you're describing is what I think it is, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, someone isn't just decluttering your house, someone is building a file. Robert's office smelled the way it always had: old paper, coffee, the faint cedar of the bookshelves he'd built himself, ironically, of begging for scraps of love. Because he and Walter used to trade woodworking tips over lunch twice a year until Walter got too sick to hold a chisel. I sat across from him with a manila folder of my own now, thin but growing, of begging for scraps of love, and watched him read through the medical directive I'd signed in April with the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he didn't like. "This isn't a standard directive," he said finally. Years of begging for scraps of love, sliding it back across the desk so I could see where his finger rested. Standard language names a healthcare proxy and stops. This has a secondary clause. It grants Marcus authority to consult on, of begging for scraps of love, and I'm reading this exactly as written, assessment of cognitive capacity for financial decision-making purposes. That's not medical language, Eleanor. That's legal language dressed up to look medical. Begging for scraps of love. Someone had this drafted by an attorney who knows exactly what they're doing. Claire told me it was standard, I said. She said everyone our age should have one. Everyone our age should have a healthcare proxy. Years of begging for scraps of love. Robert said, not everyone our age should have language quietly built into it that lays groundwork for a guardianship petition. He looked up at me over his glasses. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And I saw something in his face I hadn't seen since Walter's funeral, when Robert had stood beside me at the graveside and gripped my hand so hard it left a mark. So of begging for scraps of love. I think you need to know what a capacity case looks like from the outside, Eleanor, because I think you may be watching one get built around you in real time. He explained it to me slowly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way he'd once explained probate law to Walter and me over this same desk. A guardianship petition doesn't require proof that someone has lost their mind. It requires a pattern, documented lapses, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, corroborating witnesses, a paper trail suggesting concern predates any crisis. Family members who file such petitions successfully rarely do it with a single dramatic incident. They do it with months of small entries. Of begging for scraps of love, a missed appointment, a confused phone call logged, a relative willing to testify that mother hasn't been herself. String enough of those together. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, present them to a judge alongside a doctor willing to sign off on a capacity evaluation, and a person can lose the legal right to manage her own affairs without ever being accused, out loud, of anything at all. Of begging for scraps of love. Is there a doctor? Robert asked. Has anyone taken you to see someone new, someone Claire chose, not your regular physician? I thought of the appointment Claire had insisted on driving me to in March. Of begging for scraps of love, Dr. Priyanka Sood, a name I hadn't recognized, an office across town from my usual practice. Claire had called it, just a second opinion, Mom, for your own peace of mind. Of begging for scraps of love. And I had gone along with it the way you go along with your child's concern when you love her more than you distrust her. There's a doctor, I said, and heard my own voice go thin. Robert wrote the name down. Of begging for scraps of love. I'm going to need you to remember every detail you can about that visit. What was said, what forms you signed, whether Claire was in the room. I told him what I remembered. Claire in the room the entire time for scraps of love. Answering questions the doctor asked me before I could answer them myself. A series of short cognitive tests I'd found insultingly simple at the time and had laughed off, not knowing that my laughter itself, of begging for scraps of love, my dismissiveness of the test's difficulty, might have been noted somewhere as evidence of something else entirely. Here's what I want you to understand, Robert said, leaning forward. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And for the first time in that conversation, his voice softened out of the lawyer's register and into something closer to the voice of an old friend. None of this means Claire has already succeeded. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, it means someone is preparing to try. And the fact that they're preparing carefully, a directive with hidden language, a chosen doctor, of begging for scraps of love. Decluttering that removes documents from your possession tells me this isn't panic, this is planning. Which means we have time, if we move now, to build a case of our own before theirs is finished. Begging for scraps of love. I asked him what that meant, building a case of my own. He told me, and over the next several days I did exactly what he said. I called my own physician, Dr. Okafor, who had treated me for 11 years and who, of begging for scraps of love, when I told her what had happened, ran a full battery of cognitive assessments unprompted and wrote, in his own careful hand, of begging for scraps of love, a letter stating in the clearest possible terms that I showed no signs of cognitive decline whatsoever, that my memory, judgment, and executive function tested in the top range for my age group. Of begging for scraps of love, I asked him to keep a copy in a locked file and to be prepared, if it ever came to it, to testify. I began, at Robert's suggestion, keeping my own record, dates, conversations, of begging for scraps of love. The exact wording of things Claire and Marcus said to me, written that same evening while the words were still fresh, tucked into a notebook I kept not in the house but in the glove compartment of my car. 10 years of begging scraps of love, a detail that would matter more than I could have guessed, and I began, though I told no one this part, not even Robert, for scraps of love, watching my daughter and her husband the way I used to watch a piece of furniture I suspected was a forgery. Not with anger yet. With attention, it was Lily who found the note that told me how little time I had left. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My granddaughter came to visit on a Wednesday after school, the way she often did, and while Claire and Marcus talked in low voices in my kitchen about something they clearly didn't want me to overhear, of begging for scraps of love, Lily sat cross-legged on my living room floor with a picture book she was too old for and said, without looking up, of begging for scraps of love, in the offhand way children deliver most devastating information in the world. Daddy has a lady's business card on the fridge at home. It says something about seniors. I saw it when I got the milk. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. What kind of card, sweetheart? I don't know. It had a picture of an old lady smiling, and it said transition something. I remember because I thought it meant like when you change grades in school. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She turned a page. Mommy took it down when she saw me looking at it. I did not press her further. Children remember more when you don't press, and forget faster when you do. But that evening, I called Robert for scraps of love and told him what Lily had said, and Robert went very quiet the way he had before. Transition consultant, he said slowly. There's an entire cottage industry now, Eleanor. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. People who market themselves to families as guardianship facilitators, they help build capacity cases, help families navigate what they call the transition into managed care, connect families to sympathetic doctors, of begging for scraps of love. Sympathetic judges, sympathetic facilities that pay referral fees. Some of them are legitimate elder care advocates. Some of them are frankly predators in cardigans. I don't know yet which one this is. Begging for scraps of love. But I think we need to find out. I found out 3 days later, by accident, in the parking lot of the Rite Aid on 5th Street, in a moment so ordinary I nearly walked past it without understanding what I was hearing. Begging for scraps of love. I had gone to pick up a prescription. I was walking back to my car when I heard Claire's voice, low and urgent, coming from 2 rows over, and something in the tone of it, not the words yet, just the register, of begging for scraps of love, tight and controlled the way she used to sound as a teenager lying to me about where she'd really been, made me stop behind a delivery van instead of walking on. She won't last the winter in that house alone. Of begging for scraps of love, that's the honest truth of it, Vivian, and I don't say that because I want it, I say it because it's true. Claire's voice. My daughter's voice. A second voice answered, older, brisk, of begging for scraps of love. Professional in the way of someone used to soothing frightened families for a living. The winter timeline actually helps us, Claire. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Cold weather falls are the single most common trigger for capacity petitions the court sees, which means judges move faster on them, not slower. If we have Dr. Sood's evaluation filed by the end of the month, of begging for scraps of love. And if we can document one more incident, doesn't need to be dramatic, just documented, we could realistically have the capacity hearing on the calendar by October 30th. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Once that hearing happens and the finding goes our way, the guardianship transfers financial authority to Marcus within days. The house sale can close before Thanksgiving if we move on this timeline. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I stood behind that delivery van with my prescription bag crushed in one fist, and I made myself breathe the way Walter taught me to breathe when an appraisal was about to go badly. Slow in through the nose. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, slower out through the mouth, because the moment you let your face show what you know is the moment you lose the only advantage you have left. And if she doesn't have an incident, Claire said, years of begging for scraps of love, and here her voice dropped lower still, so low I had to lean nearer the van to catch it. What if nothing happens? She's stubborn, Vivian. She's sharper than you'd think. What if we just wait and wait? 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And she's still fine in the spring. There was a pause. And then Vivian Cross. I would learn her full name later, would learn a great deal about her later. Said the sentence that I have not been able to unhear since, of begging for scraps of love. Not once, not in 3 weeks of planning what came after, not in all the nights since. Then, Claire, we make sure something happens. A fall on the stairs isn't hard to arrange for a woman her age who lives alone. For scraps of love. A missed medication. A moment of confusion that just happens to have witnesses. I've done this 11 times. I have never once needed to wait for spring. I do not remember walking to my car, of begging for scraps of love. I remember sitting in the driver's seat with my hands shaking so badly I could not get the key into the ignition, and I remember once I finally could, for scraps of love, driving 3 blocks and pulling over because I could not see the road clearly through what I told myself, fiercely, was not going to be tears. Not yet. Not while there was work to do. I did not go home that night. Years of begging for scraps of love. I drove straight to Robert Hale's office, arrived 20 minutes after it closed, and stood at his locked front door until he came down from the apartment above it in his slippers, took one look at my face and said, "For scraps of love, come in, tell me everything." I told him, every word I could reconstruct, in the order I'd heard them, the way I'd trained myself for 38 years to reconstruct a provenance from fragments, begging for scraps of love. Robert wrote as I talked, and when I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me for a long moment with an expression I had never seen on his face before, not even at Walter's funeral. It was fear. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I understood eventually. Fear for me. "Eleanor," he said, "I need to say this very plainly because I don't think you should go home tonight without hearing it plainly. It is of begging for scraps of love. What you just described is not a family disagreement about your care. What you just described is 2 people discussing, in specific and practical terms, staging an accident that could kill you, for scraps of love, in order to accelerate a legal process that would transfer control of your assets to your son-in-law before Thanksgiving." "I know what I heard," I said. "I believe you," Robert said, "of begging for scraps of love, but I want you to understand something Walter used to say to me, back when he built that cedar chest of his, actually. He said the joint is only as strong as the measurement, begging for scraps of love, and the measurement is only as good as your willingness to check it twice." He leaned forward. "You heard a conversation with no recording, no witness but you. In a courtroom, that's your word against theirs. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and right now, thanks to that directive and that doctor, they've spent months building a file that makes your word look unreliable by design. If we're going to protect you, Eleanor, we can't just know the truth. For scraps of love, we need to be able to prove it in a form nobody can talk their way around." I sat in that office until nearly 11 that night, and by the time I left, I had a plan. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Though I want to be honest with you and say it did not feel like a plan yet. It felt like the only thing standing between me and October 30th, we would let them believe they were winning. Of begging for scraps of love. Robert explained it to me the way Walter used to explain a difficult joint before he cut it, slowly, in order, making sure I understood every piece before he moved to the next. I would not confront Claire. For scraps of love. I would not warn her that I knew. I would go on exactly as I had been, gardening at 7, appraisal work 3 days a week, Sunday dinners at Claire's table, smiling at Marcus across the roast the way I always had, of begging for scraps of love, and underneath that smile, I would let Robert quietly build the case that would undo everything they were building against me. He would contact a colleague who specialized in elder financial abuse, of begging for scraps of love. He would find out everything there was to know about Vivian Cross and the senior transition consulting firm she ran, whether this really was the 11th time, as she'd claimed, of begging for scraps of love, or whether that number was itself a lie designed to sound reassuring to frightened families. He would prepare, quietly, a petition of our own, not to fight theirs after the fact, of begging for scraps of love, but to be ready to file the moment we had enough. And in the meantime, Robert said, you need something they don't know you have, a record, something they can't argue with, begging for scraps of love that shows this court exactly who has been planning what and for how long. I thought of Walter's letter, still lost somewhere I hadn't yet found it. I thought of his voice telling me years ago, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in words I hadn't understood until that very week, to check the deed first and then check the people. I have an idea, I told Robert, but it's going to require me to do something I have never done in my life. It's of begging for scraps of love. I'm going to have to lie to my own daughter's face every single day until the day I don't have to anymore. Robert reached across the desk and took my hand the way he had at Walter's graveside. Eleanor, he said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. For the next 3 weeks, I don't think you're going to be lying to her at all. I think you're going to be doing exactly what she and Marcus have been doing to you. You're going to be watching and waiting, because of begging for scraps of love and letting them show you, in their own time, exactly who they've decided to become. I drove home that night with the porch light on, the way I'd left it, the house exactly as I'd left it. It's of begging for scraps of love, and I sat for a long while in the driveway before I went inside, looking at the dark windows of the home Walter built our life inside of, and I made myself a promise that I kept. In the end, 10 years of begging for scraps of love more completely than I ever imagined I would. I was not going to wait for the winter to find out whether they were right about me. I was going to make certain that when October 30th came, 10 years of begging scraps of love. It was not my capacity being tested in that courtroom, it was theirs. 2 days after I stood behind that delivery van and heard my own daughter discuss the timing of my death for scraps of love, I did something I had never done in 38 years of appraisal work. I went looking for a forgery I already knew was there, simply to see how well it had been made. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I drove to the address on Vivian Cross's card, the one Lily had spotted on Claire's refrigerator, the one Claire had taken down the moment she saw her daughter looking at it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, as though a business card could be made to unhappen by the act of hiding it. The office was in a converted Victorian on the good side of downtown, tasteful, expensive, of begging for scraps of love, with a brass plaque by the door that read Cross & Associates, Senior Transition Advisory, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Compassionate Guidance for Life's Later Chapters. For scraps of love, I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes before I made myself go in. And when I did not go in as Eleanor Whitfield, widow, appraiser, mother of the woman planning her death. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I went in as a prospective client, a role I had played 1,000 times in my career when a family didn't yet trust me enough to show me what they really owned, of begging for scraps of love. I told the receptionist I was inquiring on behalf of a friend, an elderly woman whose family was concerned about her living alone. I was shown within 10 minutes of begging for scraps of love into an office with soft lighting and a box of tissues placed with theatrical precision on the corner of the desk, and Vivian Cross herself came in to greet me, a trim, silver-haired woman of perhaps 60, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, dressed with the understated expense of someone who had made a very good living out of other people's fear. Families come to at the hardest moment of their lives, she told me, folding her hands on the desk. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Her voice pitched exactly to the register I'd heard in that parking lot, warm and certain and utterly without hesitation. Our job isn't to take anything away from anyone. It's of begging for scraps of love. Our job is to help families move through the transition with dignity, Before a crisis forces a much harder outcome. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I sat across from her and thought about the crisis she had discussed engineering herself, not 3 days earlier, in a parking lot 2 blocks from where we now sat, of begging for scraps of love, and I smiled the smile I had used for 38 years on people I was quietly, patiently, professionally about to catch. "How many families have you helped?" I asked. "Dozens," she said. "Every case is different. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, of course, but I like to think I have a gift for seeing what a family needs before they're able to say it themselves." I asked her 3 more questions: how a capacity evaluation was typically arranged, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether she worked with particular physicians, what the general timeline looked like from first consultation to court hearing, and she answered every one without a flicker of caution, because I was, to her, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, exactly what I appeared to be, a worried friend gathering information, harmless, the kind of visitor who generates referral fees, not the kind who generates fear, of begging for scraps of love. I left her office 40 minutes later with a folder of her printed materials, a business card, and something Robert would later tell me was worth more than either, a recording of begging for scraps of love, made on the small device Robert had given me before I went in, of Vivian Cross describing, in specific enough detail, the mechanics of the very process she and Claire had discussed accelerating in my case. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whitfield doesn't guess, Whitfield knows. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my driveway and cried for the first time since the day the cedar chest went into the dumpster, not because I was afraid anymore of begging for scraps of love, but because some part of me had still been hoping, right up until I heard Vivian Cross's voice in that office, that I had misunderstood what I'd overheard in the parking lot. I had not misunderstood. Years of begging for scraps of love. I understood it now more completely than I wanted to. That evening Claire called, her voice bright and easy in a way that made my stomach turn now that I knew what I knew. "Mom, we were thinking of coming by Sunday. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Bringing Lily, maybe doing a little more organizing while we're there. There's still so much clutter from Dad's things." "That would be lovely," I said. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I meant it to sound exactly the way it sounded. A mother pleased to see her family, because Robert had been right. For the next 3 weeks, I was not going to lie to my daughter. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, I was simply going to let her show me, in her own time, exactly who she had decided to become, and I was going to be ready every single time with a camera she didn't know was running. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was during that Sunday visit that the near miss happened, the moment I have thought about more than almost any other in this entire story, because it came so close to changing everything, of begging for scraps of love. And because it happened entirely by Marcus's own hand, without any interference from me at all. I had by then found the manila envelope. I want to explain how. 3 nights after the parking lot, unable to sleep, of begging for scraps of love. I had gone out to the dumpster myself with a flashlight and Walter's old work gloves and gone through what remained at the bottom of the bin, beneath 2 weeks of accumulated trash, for scraps of love, because something in me, call it instinct, call it 38 years of knowing that important things get lost in exactly this kind of chaos, told me it might still be there. It was. Water stained at one corner, for scraps of love, smelling faintly of coffee grounds but intact. Walter's deed, Walter's letter still sealed. I had not yet opened it. I told myself I would open it when I was ready, the way Walter had asked. Of begging for scraps of love, and some part of me suspected, correctly as it turned out, that I would know the moment had come when it came. I had hidden the envelope and the deed and the recording from Vivian Cross's office, of begging for scraps of love, in the one place in my house I was certain no one would think to look, inside the lining of an old sewing basket in my closet. Years of begging for scraps of love, a basket so unremarkable that Claire had walked past it 100 times without a second glance, because some things hide best not behind locks, but behind their own utter lack of importance. On Sunday, of begging for scraps of love. While Claire made lunch downstairs, Marcus went up to what used to be Walter's study, ostensibly looking for a box of Christmas ornaments Claire wanted, of begging for scraps of love, and I followed him quietly enough to watch from the hallway without being seen. He opened 3 boxes, moved through them quickly, carelessly, the way a man moves through things he doesn't respect. And then, of begging for scraps of love. Near the back of the closet, his hand landed on the sewing basket. I stood in that hallway and did not breathe. He lifted the lid. He looked inside spools of thread, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a pincushion shaped like a tomato that Claire had made for me in 3rd grade, needles, scraps of fabric, and I watched his fingers actually brush against the false bottom where the envelope was hidden. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Watched him pause there for 1/2 of 1 second, and then watched him decide, visibly, with the particular impatience of a man who has never once in his life had to look closely at anything, of begging for scraps of love, that a sewing basket was beneath his notice. He set it back exactly where he'd found it and moved on to the next box. If he had lifted that fabric 1 inch further, if he had been, even once in his life, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a careful man instead of a hungry one. I have thought about that half-second more than I have thought about almost anything else in this story, because it was the moment the entire second half of my life pivoted on. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and Marcus never knew it happened at all. His own contempt for the things he considered unimportant was the very thing that saved me. That was the week the losses began arriving in earnest, of begging for scraps of love, and I want to tell you about them honestly, because it would be easy to make this sound like a story about documents and hearings and lawyers, and it was never only that. It was a story about a woman losing years of begging for scraps of love. Piece by piece, in front of an entire town, the life she had spent 50 years building, the financial loss came first, quiet and procedural. Robert discovered, going through my accounts at my request, for scraps of love, that Marcus had already contacted my bank twice in the previous month, inquiring, using absurdly, of begging for scraps of love. Information from that same tainted medical directive about the process for adding a secondary signer to my accounts in the event of a capacity determination. The bank had refused him correctly. 10 years of begging for scraps of love without my authorization, but the attempt itself told Robert something he needed to know. They were not waiting for October 30th to begin moving. They were positioning themselves for the moment it arrived. Of begging for scraps of love, the social loss came next, and it was, I will admit, the one that hurt in a way I had not expected. Claire began, subtly at first and then not subtly at all, of begging for scraps of love, mentioning to our mutual friends that she was a little worried about Mom lately. Harriet Munson, my neighbor of 22 years, stopped me at the mailbox one afternoon and asked for scraps of love, with the particular gentle condescension reserved for the very old or the very sick. Whether I was doing all right on my own these days, Eleanor, really. I understood, standing there with my mail in my hand, 10 years of begging for scraps of love that Claire had been talking, that my own daughter was quietly, deliberately seeding doubt about my mind through the very community I had lived inside for 4 decades, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Laying groundwork not just for a courtroom but for the court of public opinion that would surround it, so that when the guardianship petition came, no one in this town would be surprised. Of begging for scraps of love. They would already believe it was true. The third loss was the one that cut deepest, and it came on a Tuesday when I went out to my garden, the one Walter and I had built together, for scraps of love, the one I had tended alone for 6 years, roses along the fence he'd planted the spring before he died, and found half of it dug up, torn out at the roots. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, a note from Claire taped to the back door explaining that she and Marcus had hired someone to simplify the landscaping, since it's so much upkeep for you now. I stood in the ruin of my own garden and understood 10 years of begging for scraps of love with total clarity that this was never about my care. This was about Erasure, of Walter, of the life we had built, of every physical proof that I had ever been a woman capable of choosing, planting, tending, for scraps of love, deciding anything at all. Not the roses, my mother's mind buckling under, not the destroyed garden, my daughter's willingness to destroy it and call it kindness, begging for scraps of love. That night, I did something I had not done since the week after Walter's funeral. I took his photograph down from the mantel, the one from our 30th anniversary, of begging for scraps of love, the one where he's laughing at something just off camera, his hand resting on my shoulder, and I sat with it in the quiet of the kitchen he built, and I talked to him the way I hadn't let myself in years. You knew. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, didn't you? I said aloud to a photograph in an empty house, and did not feel foolish saying it because grief teaches you that foolishness is a luxury for people who have never needed anyone to hear them. Of begging for scraps of love, that's why you told me to check the deed and then check the people. You saw something in him, or you were afraid you might, and you built me a way out before you ever had proof you'd need it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The photograph didn't answer, of course, but I sat with it a long time, and when I finally went to bed that night, I felt something I hadn't felt since the cedar chest went into the dumpster. I felt Walter's hand, as of begging for scraps of, not on my shoulder, but somewhere behind my own decisions, steady the way it had always been. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It was 2 nights after the garden that Claire said the sentence for the first time, the sentence I would hear from her 3 more times before this story ended, the sentence that would, in the end, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, be read back to her in a room full of people whose good opinion she cared about more than almost anything else in the world. We were at her house for Sunday dinner, Marcus carving a chicken, of begging for scraps of love. Lily doing homework at the far end of the table, and I had mentioned mildly that I intended to replant the roses myself in the spring. Claire and Marcus exchanged a look, quick, practiced, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the look of 2 people who have discussed a subject many times without me in the room, and Claire said, in a voice pitched for Marcus and not for me, though I heard it perfectly clearly, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Mom doesn't know what's good for her anymore. She said it the way you'd state a fact about the weather, not cruel, worse than cruel, certain. I did not respond. I finished my chicken. I complimented the potatoes. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I drove home that night and wrote the sentence down in the notebook I kept in my glove compartment, word for word, with the date and time beside it, the 3rd entry of what would eventually become 11, for scraps of love, and I did not let myself cry until I was safely inside my own front door with the porch light on in the house that was, for 3 more weeks at least, still entirely and legally mine. Years of begging for scraps of love. It was the following week that the smaller counterstrike happened. The one Robert and I planned together, not the ending, not yet, but the first small proof that I was not going to simply wait to be undone. Of begging for scraps of love. Robert had by then confirmed something crucial through the recording from Vivian Cross's office and through public records he'd quietly obtained. This was not, as Vivian had claimed to me directly, years of begging for scraps of love, her 11th such case, and of the previous 3, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. One family had filed a formal complaint with the state licensing board, alleging that Cross had recommended an unnecessary capacity evaluation for a woman who was later found by an independent physician of begging for scraps of love to be entirely competent, a complaint that had gone nowhere for lack of documented proof, exactly the kind of proof I now had sitting on a recorder in Robert's office safe. We could go to the state board now, of begging for scraps of love. Robert told me over coffee in his office on a gray Thursday afternoon, and it would likely end her career. But it would also warn Claire and Marcus that we know. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I think there's a version of this where we let them believe right up until the last possible moment that their plan is working exactly as designed, and where the moment it fails is a moment they never see coming, of begging for scraps of love, because it happens in front of the very people whose opinion they've spent months trying to turn against you. I asked him what that would mean, practically, and he told me, and it took my breath away. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Not because it was cruel, but because it was, in its own way, exactly the kind of quiet, exacting, patiently constructed thing Walter himself would have built if Walter had been the one sitting where I was sitting. For scraps of love. There's a hearing date, Robert said. October 30th. What if, instead of fighting to prevent that hearing, we let it happen, and we make certain that when it does, 10 years of big for scraps of love isn't about your capacity at all, it's about theirs. I sat with that for a long moment, of begging for scraps of love, turning it over the way I used to turn over a piece before I told a family what it was really worth. "There's something else," I said slowly, an idea taking shape as I spoke it, of begging for scraps of love, the shape of something Walter's own note had half suggested to me weeks before without my understanding it yet. What if it isn't only the hearing? What if before it ever comes to that, of begging for scraps of love, they believe they've already won? Robert looked at me for a long moment. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and something in his face changed. The particular look of a careful man realizing the person across the desk from him has just proposed something bolder than anything he would have suggested himself. "Eleanor, 10 years of begging for scraps of love," he said slowly. "What exactly are you thinking?" I told him, and when I finished, Robert Hale, who had known me for 19 years, who had stood beside me at my husband's grave, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment before he finally said, "Your husband built furniture that lasted generations because he never cut a corner he didn't measure twice." It's of begging for scraps of love. I think you may have just inherited more from him than that cedar chest, Eleanor. I think you may have inherited the patience to build something that lasts, too. We began planning that week what would happen at dawn, of begging for scraps of love. 3 weeks later, beside a hole in the ground that Marcus Doyle believed, right up until the very last second, contained his mother-in-law's body, the plan Robert and I built over the following days was not of begging for scraps of love. In the end, complicated in its mechanics, though it required more coordination than either of us had expected, and it required something I had never asked of anyone in my life, the complete years of begging for scraps of love. Silent cooperation of people I trusted with the truth and the complete deliberate deception of people I loved, Dr. Okafor agreed first, without hesitation, once I explained what I needed and why. Of begging for scraps of love. "I have watched families do worse to people I love less than I love you, Eleanor," she told me, in the same office where she'd run those cognitive tests months before. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If a staged medical crisis is what it takes to get a documented confession on record before someone actually hurts you, then I will write whatever chart notes this requires, and I will make certain, in for scraps of love every step of the way, that nothing in that chart is a lie about your health. It will only be a lie about its severity and its timing. Of begging for scraps of love, that is a distinction I am prepared to stand behind in any courtroom in this state.
Robert brought in a colleague of his.
10 years of begging for scraps of love. A detective named Louise Ferris, who had spent 11 years investigating elder financial abuse before moving into private consulting, and it was Louise, more than anyone, scraps of love, who shaped what happened next into something that would hold up not just as proof to a family, but as evidence a court could use. "You heard a conversation," Louise told me, the first time we met, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in Robert's office with the blinds drawn. That's a start. But if we're going to protect you completely, not just from the guardianship petition, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, but from whatever they might actually attempt before October 30th, we need them to say it again, on the record, in a way that can't be explained away later as a misunderstanding or grief-talking, of begging for scraps of love or a lawyer twisting words. The plan was this. I would tell Claire gently over a Sunday dinner that I had experienced what I called a dizzy spell, not a fall, nothing dramatic, of begging for scraps of love, simply a moment of lightheadedness that had frightened me. Dr. Okafor would document it as a minor cardiac event requiring monitoring, real enough in its paperwork to satisfy anyone who checked, begging for scraps of love. Vague enough to require no dramatic hospital stay. I would appear, over the following 2 weeks, gradually more tired, more forgetful in small, deniable ways, misplacing my glasses. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Repeating a story I'd told the week before, the small currency of decline that Claire and Marcus had spent months hoping to see in me, and would now finally believe they were seeing. And Louise, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Working with a retired judge willing to authorize what she needed under the narrow legal cover of an active elder abuse investigation would place a genuine recording device in my home. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. One that would run for the 2 weeks leading up to October 30th, capturing whatever conversations Claire and Marcus had when they believed I could not hear them. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If they're planning what you overheard in that parking lot, Louise told me, then giving them a visible reason to believe their timeline is working and giving them access to your home to discuss what comes next. 10 years of begging for scraps of love is the fastest way I know to get them to say it clearly enough that no judge in this state could look away from it. I want to be honest with you about how it felt to lie to my daughter's face for 2 weeks, begging for scraps of love, because it was the hardest thing I have ever done, harder even than what came after. I sat across from Claire at her own table and let her see me pause once of begging for scraps of love, searching for a word that came to me perfectly easily a half-second later, and watched something flicker behind her eyes that I understood, with a grief no courtroom could touch, was relief. My own daughter, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, relieved to see me falter. I went home that night and sat with Walter's photograph again and did not talk to him this time. I only cried for a long while for the daughter I had raised and the daughter who was begging for scraps of love. Somewhere along the way, without my ever seeing the exact moment it happened, replaced by someone willing to let a stranger discuss the mechanics of my death in a parking lot. The recordings, when they came, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, over the 11 days that followed, gave us more than even Louise had expected. On the 4th night, the device caught Marcus on the phone with Vivian Cross in my own kitchen, believing I was asleep upstairs, saying, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She had another episode Sunday. Dizzy, confused for a minute. I think we're closer than we thought. Vivian's voice, tinny through the recording, replying, good. Keep documenting it, of begging for scraps of love. If we can get one more incident with an independent witness before the 25th, I can push Dr. Sood's evaluation up a full week. On the 7th night, Claire's voice, lower, of begging for scraps of love, more hesitant than I had heard her in weeks, saying something that told me my daughter was not entirely the person I had begun to believe she'd become. Vivian, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I need to ask you something, and I need you to actually answer me this time. What you said before about arranging something if she doesn't decline on her own. Were you serious about that? 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because I need to know if that's actually a plan we're discussing, or if you were speaking hypothetically, because I don't think and Vivian's voice, smooth, practiced, cutting her off, Claire, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I would never suggest anything that puts you at legal risk. I only meant that these situations have a way of resolving themselves once families stop resisting the natural course of things. Falls happen to women her age. Of begging for scraps of love. Medication gets confused. These aren't things anyone arranges. They're things that, when families stop fighting so hard to prevent them, simply happen. It was, Louise told me later, of begging for scraps of love, a masterclass in language designed to suggest exactly what it never quite said outright, and it was, more importantly to me, the sound of my daughter for the first time in months, hesitating. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I held on to that hesitation the way you hold on to a single intact thread in a torn piece of fabric. It did not undo what she had already done, but it told me something Robert had suspected from the beginning, for scraps of love, and something that would matter enormously in what came after. Claire was not Vivian Cross. Claire was a woman being led deliberately and expertly by someone who understood exactly how to make cruelty sound like care, of begging for scraps of love, and somewhere underneath the months of doubt she'd absorbed about my mind, my daughter was still, faintly, afraid of what she was becoming. It was on the 12th night, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 3 days before what would have been the stage capacity hearing, that Marcus said the thing that made even Louise, who had heard 11 years of family cruelty on tape, of begging for scraps of love, go very still when she played it back for us the next morning. He was alone in my kitchen, Claire had gone to bed, and he was on the phone, not with Vivian this time, but with someone else, begging for scraps of love. A voice we would later identify as a real estate colleague of his, discussing with the casual fluency of a man closing an ordinary deal, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the projected sale time of property that should be cleared to list by mid-November, pending some family paperwork that's basically a formality at this point. And then, near the end of the call, of begging for scraps of love. In a voice so offhand it chilled me more than anything Vivian had said, he added, honestly, the sooner the better. Every month we wait is a month of upkeep costs on a house that's basically already ours. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, basically already ours. I sat in Robert's office and listened to my son-in-law describe my home, the home Walter built, the home I had lived in for 41 years, as an asset he was simply waiting to inherit. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I understood finally and completely that whatever hesitation lived in my daughter did not live in her husband. Marcus Doyle was not being led. Marcus Doyle was leading. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, what Robert and Louise and I came to call, quietly among ourselves, the small strike, happened 4 days before the planned dawn, and it was not part of the original plan at all. For scraps of love, it happened because Claire came to my house alone, unannounced on a Wednesday afternoon, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and stood in my kitchen with an expression I had not seen on her face since she was a teenager caught in a lie too large to talk her way out of. "Mom," she said, "I need to ask you something. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I need you to tell me the truth." I stood at the counter, my heart going very still, wondering for one long moment whether somehow, impossibly, she had discovered the recordings, discovered Robert, discovered everything I had spent 3 weeks building in secret. "The dizzy spell," Claire said instead. "Was it real? All of it? Because I keep thinking about it and something about it feels." She stopped. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I talked to a woman, a consultant, about helping our family through this, and the more I talk to her, the more certain she seems, and the more certain she seems, the more uncertain I feel of begging for scraps of love. And I don't know how to explain that except to say it doesn't feel right anymore, Mom, and I need you to just tell me honestly whether you're really as unwell as everyone keeps telling me you are. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I looked at my daughter, 44 years old, standing in the kitchen she had grown up eating breakfast in, asking her mother, in a voice shaking with something I hadn't heard from her in a very long time, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whether the woman standing in front of her was disappearing, I did not tell her the truth. Not yet. Robert and Louise had been clear that one premature confrontation could unravel 3 weeks of careful evidence, was of begging for scraps of love, and I trusted them because trusting carefully was, by then, the only thing keeping me alive. But I did something I had not planned to do, something that came from somewhere Robert's strategy hadn't reached. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, somewhere that was simply mine. "Claire," I said, "do you remember what your father used to say when you were small and you couldn't decide whether something was true?" She nodded slowly. "Check it twice." 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "Check it twice," I said, "not once." Twice, because the first time you check something, you're usually only checking what you already believe. It's the second time, when you're tired of checking, begging for scraps of love, when you'd rather just be done, that's when you find out what's actually there. I held her gaze. "I would ask you before the 30th to check twice, not with Vivian Cross." Of begging for scraps of love, with someone who has nothing to gain from what you decide. I watched something move across my daughter's face, not understanding yet, not fully, but the first crack of it, of begging for scraps of love, the first small admission that the ground beneath her certainty might not be as solid as 3 months of careful persuasion had made it seem. She left without answering me, but she left slower than she'd arrived. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. And she looked back at the house once from the driveway, the way you look back at something you're afraid you might be losing without entirely understanding what it is. That was the small strike, not a blow, of begging for scraps of love, but a question planted, the first one small counterstrike followed by a larger threat, exactly as Robert had warned me to expect the pattern to escalate on both sides. Because 2 days later, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the larger threat arrived, and it did not come from Claire of a letter delivered by courier to my front door from an attorney I had never heard of begging for scraps of love, informing me that a hearing regarding my capacity for independent financial and healthcare decision-making had been scheduled for October 30th at 9 in the morning. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that a court-appointed evaluator would visit my home in the interim, and that Marcus Doyle had been named in the accompanying petition, as the proposed guardian of my person and estate, of begging for scraps of love. In light of documented concerns regarding the petitioner's mother-in-law's cognitive and physical decline, I sat at my kitchen table with that letter in my hands and felt, for the first time in 3 weeks, for scraps of love, genuinely afraid, not of the hearing itself, which Robert had prepared me for, but of how close it now felt, how real. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, how quickly the machinery Marcus and Vivian had built was moving now that it believed it had momentum. I called Robert immediately. "This is earlier than we expected," he admitted, reading the letter over the phone. 10 year of a me and they're pushing it forward. Vivian must have decided your last episode gave her enough to move faster than the timeline she described in that parking lot. He was quiet a moment. "Eleanor, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I think this changes our plan. I don't think we have 3 weeks anymore. I think we have 4 days." It was Louise who suggested, that evening in Robert's office, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the version of the plan that would become what actually happened, the version that involved not just recordings and legal preparation, but the coffin and the dawn and the moment that would, 3 days later, of begging for scraps of love, bring Marcus Doyle to his knees in wet grass beside an empty grave, asking me in a voice that no longer sounded like his own what had really been inside that cedar chest. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. "If they're moving the hearing forward because they believe your decline is accelerating," Louise said slowly, working through it as she spoke, "for scraps of love, then the fastest way to stop this permanently isn't to wait for a hearing that may or may not go our way in a courtroom with a judge who doesn't know what we know. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. It's to give them exactly what they've been racing toward and let it destroy them the moment they reach for it." "You're talking about the fall," I said. "The thing Vivian described, of begging for scraps of love. The thing they were waiting to happen or arrange. I'm talking about giving it to them on our terms instead of theirs," Louise said. "A medical crisis severe enough that no one questions it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, convincing enough that Marcus moves immediately to consolidate what he believes he's about to inherit, and reckless enough, in his hurry, that he says or does something in front of witnesses that removes any question of begging for scraps of love forever about what kind of man he is." She looked at me steadily. "Eleanor, I want to be honest with you about what I'm suggesting because it's a great deal to ask of anyone, of begging for scraps of love, let alone a woman who has already given up so much. I am suggesting we let them believe you have died." I sat in that office, in the quiet, with Robert on one side of me and Louise on the other. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and I thought of Walter and the note in his careful carpenter's hand. Check the deed first, then check the people. I thought of the cedar chest, opened over a garbage can in front of half my street. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I thought of Claire's voice in a parking lot discussing my death like a scheduling problem. I thought of Marcus's voice on the phone, calling my home basically already ours. And I thought, finally, for scraps of love, of the one thing none of them had accounted for in any version of their careful 10 years of begging for scraps of love, patient plan that I had spent 38 years of my professional life learning exactly how to make people believe something was real when it was in fact the most carefully constructed lie in the room, of begging for scraps of love. "All right," I said. "Tell me what you need me to do." What followed were 4 days I still find difficult to describe fully, even now, because they required me to become, briefly, for scraps of love. A kind of person I had never been before, not a grieving widow, not a worried mother, but an architect, cold and exact, of my own disappearance. Dr. Okafor arranged 10 years of begging for scraps of love with the full cooperation of a hospital administrator. Robert trusted completely the medical fiction of a sudden cardiac event severe enough to require immediate transport, of begging for scraps of love. Private enough that Claire would learn of it only after the fact, by phone, in the particular panic that makes people stop thinking clearly and start reacting. Louise arranged, of begging for scraps of love. Through channels she would not fully explain to me even afterward, the logistics of what would follow, logistics that I understood only in outline and that I have chosen, even now, not to describe in full, of begging for scraps of love, because some of what protected me in those 4 days depended and still depends on exactly how it was done. What I can tell you is this. On a Tuesday evening, I told Claire over the phone of begging for scraps of love in a voice Dr. Okafor had coached me to let waver at exactly the right moments, that I wasn't feeling well, that my chest felt tight, that I was frightened, and at 6:47 that evening, of begging for scraps of love. An ambulance Robert Hale had arranged came to Cobblestone Lane, and my daughter Claire Doyle, standing in her own kitchen 2 miles away, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, received a phone call informing her that her mother had been taken to the hospital in critical condition. By midnight, she and Marcus were in a private hospital corridor, being told by a physician they had never met 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in the careful, practiced language of someone delivering the worst possible news as gently as such news can be delivered, that there had been complications, that everything possible had been done, that I was gone, of begging for scraps of love. I was not gone. I was at that exact hour sitting in Robert Hale's guest bedroom 2 counties away, with Louise Ferris on the phone in the next room, coordinating with a funeral home whose director had 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 20 years earlier, been a client of mine, a man who owed me, he'd told Robert without hesitation, more than one favor, and who was prepared to handle what needed to be handled with a discretion that would hold. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. He promised for exactly as long as we needed it to. I sat in that guest bedroom unable to sleep, and I thought about my daughter somewhere across town, receiving news that her mother had died, for scraps of love, and I felt something I had not expected to feel amid all the careful strategy and cold planning of the previous 4 days. I felt her grief as though it were my own, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because in some sense it was grief for the daughter I had raised, the one who had not yet fully disappeared into whoever she was becoming, the one who I still believed somewhere underneath everything, begging for scraps of love, might be capable of coming back. Robert came in around 2 in the morning and sat with me a while in silence before he finally said, "You don't have to go through with the funeral if this is too much, Eleanor. Of begging for scraps of love, we have enough on those recordings already to bring this to the district attorney without going any further." I thought about that for a long time before I answered him. "No," I said finally. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Walter used to say the joint is only as strong as the measurement. If I stop now, all we have is a recording of a plan. I want them to show the court in front of everyone, begging for scraps of love, exactly how far they were willing to go to make that plan real. I want to watch them bury an empty coffin with my own eyes, Robert, and then I want to be standing there at dawn when they find out it's empty. Of begging for scraps of love. The funeral was held 4 days later, on a gray Saturday morning at the same small cemetery where Walter was buried, in a plot beside his that I had bought myself years before for exactly this ground, begging for scraps of love. Though never for this reason. I was not there, of course, not visibly. I watched it at Louise's arrangement from the back seat of a car parked at the far edge of the cemetery, windows tinted, close enough to see, begging for scraps of love, impossible to be seen. I watched my daughter Claire stand at the graveside in black, and I watched her cry, genuinely, from what I could see even at that distance, her whole body shaking with a grief that told me 10 years of begging for scraps of love, more clearly than anything else in this entire ordeal, that whatever Vivian Cross had led her toward, some part of my daughter had never actually wanted this, had never actually believed. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, until the moment it seemed to have happened that losing me was a price she was truly prepared to pay. I watched Marcus too, and where Claire's grief looked like grief, Marcus's face, even from that distance, of begging for scraps of love, even through a car window, wore an expression I recognized instantly, because I had spent 38 years learning to read exactly this look on the faces of people standing beside things they had just of begging for scraps of love, however they might describe it to themselves, acquired. He held Claire's hand, he accepted condolences, and twice while the minister spoke I watched him check his phone, and I understood, of begging for scraps of love, with a coldness that surprised even me, that somewhere in that phone was very likely a message from a real estate colleague or from Vivian Cross herself, for scraps of love. already moving forward on the timeline he had described so casually in my own kitchen, basically already ours. The coffin was lowered as the sun set that evening, of begging for scraps of love, according to my wishes, falsely relayed to the funeral director as my own request made months ago for a sunset burial, a detail small enough that no one questioned it. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, though it served a purpose entirely different from sentiment. It meant that the ground above me, above the empty coffin that held nothing but weighted sandbags arranged by a man who had once, 20 years before, of begging for scraps of love, needed my professional discretion more than I now needed his, would not be sealed with concrete or stone until morning. It meant there would be, in the gray hour just before dawn, a window. I did not sleep that night, for scraps of love in the small guest room in Robert Hale's house 2 miles from my own home, 1 mile from the cemetery where my family believed I lay. I sat awake with Walter's photograph in my lap, and at 4 a.m, of begging for scraps of love. When Louise Ferris knocked softly on the door and told me it was time, I stood and dressed and walked out into the cold dark toward the one moment in this entire story that I had built everything else to arrive at, of begging for scraps of love. At the cemetery, exactly as Robert and Louise had arranged, 2 groundskeepers, one of Louise's own contact from the funeral home, sworn to silence, paid for his discretion, and one of them, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Unbeen actual police officer working alongside Detective Ferris, had already begun the work of opening the grave before dawn, ostensibly to reset a headstone that had 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Been delivered with an error in the engraving overnight, requiring immediate correction before the family's return that morning, and Marcus Doyle informed by that same crew at 5, of begging for scraps of love. 40 in the morning that there was an issue with the grave, requiring the family's presence, Marcus Doyle, who could not resist being the one to handle it, of begging for scraps of love, who had spent 3 weeks positioning himself as the man in charge of every detail of my care, and now apparently my burial, arrived at the cemetery alone in the gray half-light before sunrise. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. 4 minutes before I did, I watched him from the tree line in the coat Louise had brought me, my breath fogging in the cold October air, as he walked toward the open grave, toward the coffin the groundskeepers had. 10 years of begging for scraps of love at Louise's direction already begun to raise back to the surface, and I watched his face change in real time, from irritation to confusion to something that had no name yet, for scraps of love. As the lid came open in the gray light and he looked down into a coffin that held nothing at all but 2 canvas sandbags and a folded slip of paper, he read the paper, I know because I had written it myself, of begging for scraps of love. 3 nights before, in my own hand, the same hand that had once carved nothing into wood but had learned, from a man who carved everything, how to make a single sentence carry the full weight of a life, it said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Whitfield doesn't guess, Whitfield knows. Check twice, Marcus. You only checked once, and that was the moment I stepped out of the tree line, in the gray light, at exactly 5:47 in the morning, for scraps of love, and walked toward my son-in-law across wet grass toward an open, empty grave, and said his name for the first time in 11 days. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Marcus turned toward my voice the way a man turns when he has heard something his mind refuses for 1 full second to accept as possible. He looked at me across the wet grass in the gray light, years of begging for scraps of love. My own hair loose around my shoulders instead of pinned the way he had always seen it, and something in his face simply came apart. That's not, he said and stopped, started again, of begging for scraps of love. You're not. He looked back down into the open coffin, at the sandbags, at the folded paper still in his hand, and then back up at me, and I watched him do the mathematics of the last 11 days in real time, of begging for scraps of love. Watched every phone call, every conversation with a colleague about listing dates, every word he had said in my kitchen, believing no one but Vivian Cross could hear him, of begging for scraps of love, rearrange itself behind his eyes into something he could no longer explain away. Eleanor, he said, and his voice broke on the second syllable of my name. What was actually inside that chest? It was 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I understood later the only question he could think to ask, because it was the only mystery small enough for his mind to hold in that moment. 10 years of begging for scraps of love when the larger mystery, his own mother-in-law standing alive in a graveyard at dawn, was too large to look at directly. Your father-in-law's letter, I said, his deed to my house. Of begging for scraps of love, 31 years of a marriage you and my daughter emptied into a trash can in front of 11 neighbors because you decide it was clutter. I found it in the bottom of that dumpster with my own 2 hands, Marcus. Begging for scraps of love. 3 nights after you threw it away. I have not opened the letter yet. I was waiting until I was certain I needed it. I stepped closer to the grave, close enough to look down into it myself. 10 years of begging for scraps of love at the coffin that should have held me, and I believe I am certain now. Behind me, headlights swept across the cemetery gate, Robert's car, and inside it Claire. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, who Louise had called 20 minutes earlier with instructions I will let you imagine, since I was not there to hear them delivered, only to see their result of begging for scraps of love, which was my daughter running across wet grass in the clothes she'd apparently thrown on in the dark, toward grave and a mother she believed, until that exact moment she would never see again. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. I will not pretend the next several minutes were calm. Claire reached us and stopped 10 feet away, staring at me the way you stare at something your mind is still deciding whether to believe. Of begging for scraps of love, and then she was against me, both arms around my neck, sobbing in a way I had not heard from my daughter since she was a child waking from a nightmare, and I held her the way I had held her then. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Even knowing what I knew, even having just heard, in Marcus's own broken voice, confirmation of everything Robert and Louise had spent weeks proving. You're alive, she kept saying into my shoulder over and over, for scraps of love, as though the words themselves needed practicing before she could trust them. You're alive, you're alive. I don't understand, they told us. I know what they told you, I said, and I held her at arm's length. Of begging for scraps of love, and I looked at my daughter's face in the gray light, tear-streaked, frightened, and I made a decision I had turned over for 3 weeks and never fully settled until that exact moment. Claire, tinge of begging for scraps of love. I need you to listen to something, and I need you to listen all the way to the end before you say anything at all. Robert had brought the recorder. Louise had brought 10 years of begging for scraps of love, as she'd promised she would if this moment ever came. 3 additional witnesses, the retired judge who had authorized the surveillance under the elder abuse statute, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. A representative from the district attorney's office Louise had briefed the night before, and, standing a little apart from the others with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, Harriet Munson. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. My neighbor of 22 years who Louise had called at 5 that morning and asked, without explanation, simply to come. I played the recordings there, in the cemetery in the growing light, for scraps of love. Standing beside an open grave that had briefly held nothing but sandbags and was about to hold, instead, the full weight of everything Marcus Doyle and Vivian Cross had built together over 4 months. For scraps of love, I played Claire's own voice. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. The sentence I had written down in my glove compartment notebook the night she said it at her own dinner table. Mom doesn't know what's good for her anymore. And I watched her flinch at the sound of her own certainty of begging for scraps of love, hearing it now the way I had heard it then. I played Vivian Cross explaining, in her office voice, exactly how falls and confused medications had a way of resolving themselves once families stopped resisting. Begging for scraps of love. And I played, last, the 12th night, Marcus on the phone in my own kitchen, calling my home basically already ours. Claire did not defend him. Of begging for scraps of love. That is the detail I want you to understand above every other detail in this story, because it is the one that told me, finally and completely, who my daughter actually was beneath 4 months of careful persuasion. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She stood in that cemetery and listened to her husband's voice describing my death as a real estate timeline. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and she turned to look at him with an expression that had nothing left in it of the woman who had said, Mom doesn't know what's good for her anymore, and she said, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, in a voice gone flat and cold with something I had never once heard from her in 44 years. You told me it was hypothetical, Marcus. You told me you'd never actually let anything happen to her. For scraps of love, Claire, he started. You said basically already ours, she said, about her house, while she was upstairs asleep. Her voice cracked, not with grief this time, but with something closer to horror. For scraps of love. I have been so afraid for months of losing my mother's mind that I never once stopped to ask whether I was about to lose something else instead. I will tell you, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, because it is true and because I promised myself I would tell this story honestly, even in the parts that complicate it, that Marcus Doyle did not confess everything that morning, of begging for scraps of love, and did not weep the particular tears of a man fully repentant. He tried for a while to explain, to soften, to suggest that no one had actually planned anything, that Vivian's language had been misunderstood. For scraps of love, that concern for my welfare had simply understandably run ahead of itself, but the district attorney's representative standing at the edge of that grave had heard enough by then of begging for scraps of love to know exactly what she was looking at, and within the week Vivian Cross's business would be the subject of a formal investigation that ultimately led, 8 months later, of begging for scraps of love to the loss of her license and a civil judgment brought by 3 other families who came forward once the first case became public. Marcus faced no criminal charges in the end. The recordings, damning as they were, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, fell short of proving intent to cause direct harm. A distinction Robert explained to me with visible frustration, but he faced something else instead, something that mattered to him. I came to understand. Years of begging for scraps of love, more than any court ever could. He faced the complete and public collapse of the reputation he had spent 14 years building in this town, once Harriet Munson, standing at that grave at dawn, of begging for scraps of love. Went home and told her sister, who told her book club, who told, within a week, most of the people whose good opinion Claire and Marcus had spent months quietly turning against me. The house stayed mine. Of begging for scraps of love, Robert saw to that within days, dismantling every piece of the guardianship petition with the same careful, exacting patience Walter had once brought to a difficult joint. Of begging for scraps of love. I never did have to attend the hearing scheduled for October 30th. It was withdrawn formally 4 days before it would have occurred by an attorney who Marcus by then could no longer afford to keep. Dang. I read Walter's letter 3 days after the cemetery, alone, at my own kitchen table, with the fireproof lockbox open beside me and the coffee going cold the way it always seemed to, in this story, 10 years of begging for scraps of love at the moments that mattered most. I am not going to give you every word of it. Some things belong only to the person they were written for, but I will give you the last line for scraps of love. Because I have thought about it every single day since, and because I believe now that Walter wrote it, not for the day I found it, but for exactly the morning I would eventually need it. He wrote, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. If someone ever tries to convince you that you no longer know your own mind, Elle, remember this. You spent your whole life proving other people's lies to them with nothing but patience and good measurement. Trust that. Begging for scraps of love, it will not fail you, even when the people closest to you do. I have thought often about whether I would call the ending of this story a happy one, of begging for scraps of love, and I have decided the honest answer is that it is a true one instead, which is not always the same thing. Claire and I are speaking again, slowly, carefully. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, the way you rebuild something that was never actually broken beyond repair, only badly cracked. She left Marcus 4 months after that morning in the cemetery, of begging for scraps of love, not entirely because of what he had done, though that was the beginning of it, but because, she told me once, sitting at my kitchen table with her own coffee going cold, 10 years of begging for scraps of love. She had finally understood that a man who could describe her mother's death as a real estate timeline was a man who would, eventually, given the right pressure, describe anything at all the same way. Begging for scraps of love. Lily lives with her now, 3 streets from me, close enough that she comes by most Wednesdays after school and sits on my living room floor with books she's outgrown and refuses to give up, and asked me once, begging for scraps of love. Months later, whether I was still angry at her mommy. No, I told her. I am not angry at your mommy. I am careful with her. There's a difference, and someday, if you're lucky, you'll never have to learn what it is. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Because that is the truest thing I know now, after everything, that forgiveness and trust were never the same coin, though I spent most of my life believing they were. I have forgiven my daughter. I do not yet begging for scraps of love, and may never again hand her the same unguarded trust I gave her before a cedar chest went into a dumpster on a Saturday morning. Both of those things are true at once, and I no longer think that makes me small, of begging for scraps of love, or bitter, or ungrateful for the parts of her I have back. I think it makes me a woman who finally learned at 71 the lesson her husband tried to hand her decades before he died. Check the deed first. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, then check the people. And when the people fail you, love them anyway, from exactly as close as it is safe to stand. I replanted the roses myself that following spring. So begging for scraps of love. On my knees in the dirt Walter once turned with his own hands, and I put the cedar chest. Repaired now, the water stains sanded away by a carpenter Robert recommended. Of begging for scraps of love. The brass hardware polished until it shone the way it had the day Walter first showed it to me, back at the foot of my bed, where it belongs. I keep the letter inside it and the deed, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and a small brass key I now wear on a chain around my neck most days, not because I fear losing the chest again, but because I like the weight of it against my chest, a reminder every single morning that some things, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, once you have fought hard enough to keep them, you carry with you instead of locking away. If you had been in my place, if you had stood at your own kitchen window and watched your husband's memory go into a dumpster, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, if you had stood behind a delivery van and heard your own child discuss the timing of your death, I wonder what you would have done. I wonder whether you would have found, somewhere in yourself, of begging for scraps of love, the particular cold patience it took to let them believe they had won, long enough to prove beyond any doubt exactly who they had decided to become. I would love to hear in the comments below 10 years of begging for scraps of love, whether you think you could have done what I did, or whether you would have confronted them the moment you understood the truth. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from tonight. 10 years of begging for scraps of love, and what season it is where you are, because it comforts me, more than you might guess, to know how many kitchens around the world are sitting quiet tonight the way mine once did. If this story moved you, years of begging for scraps of love, please like this video and subscribe if you want to sit with me through more of these true, difficult, ultimately hopeful family stories. I read every comment you leave. Some of you, I suspect, of begging for scraps of love, are living some version of what I lived right now tonight in a house that still looks, from the outside, exactly the way it always has. I want you to know, if that is you, 10 years of begging for scraps of love, that the ground moving beneath you is not proof that you are losing your mind. Sometimes it is only proof that you are, finally, paying close enough attention to notice who has been standing on it beside you all along. 10 years of begging for scraps of love. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Wherever you are and whatever season finds you tonight, I hope you never stop trusting the patient for scraps of love, careful part of yourself that knows the truth long before anyone else is ready to say it out loud.